Okay, and welcome everybody to Chapter 6, which is lifting and moving patients. I'm going to try to be brief on this particular lecture, but there is some really important information that we need to go through. All too often, the EMT is injured in the line of duty, and most likely it's going to happen in the event of you lifting and moving or manipulating a patient to get them transported to the destination. So we're going to try to truck through this. There's some no-brainers, and then there's some really, really important techniques and critical thinking skills that are involved in this. So the introduction, as it states, is during the course of a call, EMTs move patients several times. And we can actually really look at this logistically, which is you may have to move them into position to assess them. You may have to move them to get them onto a gurney. You have to move the gurney into the back of an ambulance, and from the back of an ambulance into the hospital, off of the gurney and onto the hospital gurney. So if you're going to do this and you're going to manipulate what we essentially call dead weight, for the most part, if they're really sick, they're not going to be able to assist you, and that would be a dead weight load. Or they are combative, or maybe even trying to assist you, but in the event of their assistance, they manipulate something or create a situation where you're more likely to receive an injury from being in a poor posture or poor alignment. This says, when lifting and carrying, you must know where rescuers should be positioned, how to give and receive lifting commands, how to prepare patient moving devices, when and how to use patient moving devices. And we can boil this down to basically saying, what is the best place for you to be when you're trying to lift a patient? And that's really going to be dictated on how many people are there, and then who is going to be in charge. So if you want cooperation and teamwork, you have to have a leader, and then the rest are followers. So somebody is usually always the leader of that particular movement or group, and they're going to dictate how things are working. And then how to prepare your moving devices. So are you using a mega mover? Do you know how to use your gurney or any of the other equipment such as stair chairs, scoop stretchers, sleds, and the like? And then when are you going to use the appropriate device? So really and truly, there are two people that are really important in a patient movement. It's the patient and ultimately yourself. You're of no value to anybody if you hurt your back and you can no longer move or get the patient moved to their destination. So everything should be done methodically, well thought out, and you should be in pretty good physical condition and understand the body mechanics of movement. So moving and positioning the patient, and this is going to kind of touch into special lifting and moving techniques. And this is stating patients with chest pain or difficulty breathing. And really what we're trying to say is you don't want that patient to be self-ambulatory. We're not trying to create any more demand on the myocardium. We're already in a shock or stressful position. So that person should really be moved with the assistance of who's providing care for them. Patients with a spinal injury, although super, super rare, we definitely want to make sure that anybody who has a C-spine or a T or L spine injury moves as minimal as possible. Now, while the National Registry has taken long spine board and CAD immobilization out of the testing process, it's still kind of a skill that you should know, which is how to get a patient moved from point A to point B with the least amount of movement possible. The studies do show that extrication from a vehicle, if a patient is able to do it themselves, can do it much more safely and with much less movement along the spinal tract than we can do it for them. But in regards to extricating a patient, say up a hill because they were hiking and fell or skiing or something like that, it's going to be really, really hard to do that. Or have the patient move for a considerable amount of time or distance without compromising their spinal column. So we still want to know the logistics and how to use those devices if appropriate. Patients in shock obviously are going to need to be moved by the providers because they again are having to deal with the stress and the demand of the cardiovascular system or the respiratory system or the combination of both, trying to deal with perfusion. If they're in a compromised state, we do not want to aggravate that by creating an additional metabolic demand. Pregnant patients who are hypotensive, this is more of a positioning thing, right? So a pregnant female really should not be laying in a supine position because we don't want the fetus pushing against the great vessels. So we actually have to learn how to get them positioned into some kind of safe anatomical positioning where the fetus isn't laying against the great vessels and they're still safely transported. Obese patients pose their own huge problems, and that's no pun intended. The difficulty with that is, of course, the manpower, because we're talking about several hundred pounds, and then the logistics of moving them in and out of tight spaces. Most of these patients tend to be kind of packed away into a smaller area, and it's not only difficult for the patient to move, it's difficult to have the patient moved when you have several more large adults surrounding them trying to get them moved. So these are all logistical situations that we're going to kind of try to get through, and we're going to think and strategize our way through moving a patient without injuring ourselves or the patient. Body mechanics and lifting. If you're looking at this picture here, you can see the shoulder girdle and the spinal column and the pelvis, right? This is kind of a large power box, if you will. You have the pelvis, which is creating the stability for the legs and the spinal tract, and then the shoulder girdle, which is stabilizing the upper extremities. Now, every time we're talking about body mechanics in general, we have to take into account the torque multiplication factor, or leverages. And that means that the farther something is away from the body or the source of movement, the more force is being applied to the point of contact. So if you were to lift anything, you should try to keep things in close to your core and try to keep that in a straight line with the spinal column, so that way you can distribute the load throughout the body. Okay, so we're looking at a picture here, and this says this is the correct way to lift. And really and truly, if you're looking at this picture, we kind of have the scared cat arch in the lower back, and it's probably not actually the most ideal lift. This is more like a sumo deadlift position, and you can see his lower back to mid back is kind of rounding. And in reality, this particular person should probably be a little bit into a deeper squat stance and generating power from the hips and the thighs. This is an absolutely unacceptable position where you have somebody who's completely bent over. And if you look at this, and we talk again about the leverage, right? You have somebody that's bent at greater than 90 degrees at the hips, and you can see that the entire weight of the torso as it moves out towards the head is actually multiplying. And so for every pound of weight that is held off the end of a rod or a stick or what have you, for every foot, it's going to double, right? So if I have 10 pounds at 1 foot, if I move that same pounds to 2 feet out from its point of movement, now I have 20 foot-pounds of force at the point of movement. So these are all things, like I'm going to say, you'll hear this multiple times about torque multipliers and other things like that. Okay, so proper lifting techniques, we're talking about the legs should be shoulder width apart, and really this has to do more with what your natural mechanics are. Some people have different set of hips, or the way that they're mobile in their hips to thighs, and the general idea is that they're shoulder width apart. You may need to stand a little bit farther apart, just depending on whether or not your knees want to sweep out or in. You want to make sure that your feet are firmly planted. We should not be up on the balls of our feet or rocking back onto our heels. We want all of the force transferred completely through the soles of the feet in a flat formation. Your back is going to be upright with a nice tightness to your lower back. We want to kind of have all those muscles activated, ready for the actual lift. And then we want to make sure that we're correctly grasping the patient's stretcher or the mover, regardless of what that is, right? We want to make sure we have a firm grip on an appropriate gripping surface. So again, we're talking about lifting the patient by raising your upper body, right? And so we're going to use our lower body to engage that. We want to make sure that we have a good, firm, strong grip. We want to make sure that our muscles are engaged and ready to do the movement. And we're going to use the larger muscles in the body, which is going to be the legs and the buttocks, and to try to generate force for the movement up. At no point do we want to be using the lower back extensors to do any of that torque multiplication and create movement upwards with the patient. They're going to call this a power lift, and they really, really want to stress that you want to keep that weight close to your body. So again, Try not to bend over and lean forward when you're picking up anything that's more than a couple of pounds. It's just bad form and it's asking for an injury. Okay, now we're talking about proper hold, and the power grip gets maximum force. And so that's palms up, and then they're saying hands about 10 inches apart. And really you want your hands in a neutral position. We don't want to have our elbows flared, and we don't want to have our forearms in a pronated position where the palms are out or up, and then we're kind of wying out from a neutral position. So your forearms really should be about midline, kind of straight out from your body if at all possible. And then you want all of your fingers to be on the same plane. So if you're looking at this guy's grip here, he's kind of got his hands around the curvature. And that's not terrible, but it's not really ideal or optimum for the way that you're going to hold on to something. If we're talking about lifting a patient by a sheet or a blanket, we want to make sure that that patient is centered in there. And this is really to do about safety, because if they're not centered, you may have your one hand really high in the air and the other one's really low, because we're trying to kind of balance the patient in an off-center position, which makes it really awkward and really doesn't distribute that load across both sides of the body at the same time. More so for you than it is the patient. The patient will just notice the uncomfortableness of having to roll back and forth into a sheet or a blanket, and we really want to make sure that we don't have anything loose to trip over. And then if you have handles, right, on Mega Mover or Patient Mover or the like, make sure that you're using the handles. That's what they're designed for, and it's going to give you the best fulcrum point as well as comfort and grip stability. Okay, these are kind of no-brainers. This is lifting and carrying guidelines. Estimate your patient's weight before lifting, and you guys will hear me in class say, becoming comfortable with guessing a patient's weight, right? And we want to know what the patient weighs, and then we should kind of understand what that patient's ideal weight would look like for various reasons. But in this, we want to make sure that when we're looking at a patient and we say that somebody weighs 150 pounds, that they don't weigh 250. You may overestimate your ability to pick somebody up or your need for additional hands. And the heavier a patient is, the more people we want on deck, because we want to spread that load. And if you have just two people, as often like on a rescue, you should be able to manipulate a single person who's of a normal stature and not morbidly obese or any of our bariatric type patients. Anytime that you get somewhere in the neighborhood of 200, this is calling for 250, but I'm really looking at, if you know that you're going to need the additional assistance, you should probably get it, because it's better to have too much than not enough. Now, if you're in a two-person situation, you want to place the stronger of the two at the head, because they're going to have the torso weight. They're going to be able to deal with that kind of like 60-40 weight shift or balance, and you're going to give that stronger or larger person more accountability on the weight to be moved. Okay, going up or downstairs. If you're approaching a maximum capacity, do not attempt to lift or carry the patient a significant distance. And this is, again, kind of a no-brainer, right? If we're going for a max lift, we don't have the endurance to continue to do reps. It's quite literally a single lift. And so we want to make sure that we're being very appropriate with what we know that we can do physically and what our limitations are going to be. So if you know that you need to make it 50 feet out the door, and that patient's way larger than you know that you're going to be able to handle that for, plan for the stops. Make sure that you get them situated and sat down into a safe position several times before you get where you need to be. So when you do stop and you place them down, change the position or get them into another position. And if somebody's gassed out because they're tired, trade them out, right? We never want to put them at risk, because the highest likelihood of that injury is when we become fatigued and we tend to not have the same form. Okay, so backboards, again, this is no longer something that we're testing in class. We will talk about it, and I will try to make that familiar to any of you that need the refresher on it, because it is an essential skill that we should probably still keep. It's just not required, because the practice of leaving patients backboarded for any length of time other than extrication has kind of gone away. Stair chairs are very much still in use, and they're actually a great tool. They appear to be a little complex initially, but once you understand how it's designed, it's actually one of those tools that you'll be very happy to have on your rig when you need to move somebody up and down stairs or a tight confined space. You can effectively put a patient on this and use friction to help lower them down from an elevated position, so long as it's something like a staircase, in a safe manner, and it generally only requires 2 people. Now we're looking at the patient cot, and as you can see, this is a powered cot, and not all services have powered cots, but if you're looking at the picture, you can see a couple of buttons on the right hand side, and there's a small battery pack in the front. This is electric over hydraulic. It's 4 wheels. They're all independently moving on casters, which makes the swiveling and turning ability of this really superior to most of the furniture or other things that you may have moved with only perhaps a single set of moving casters. They're really, really difficult to manipulate in tight spaces. They can only be folded up so much, and the patient has to be sat up. And this is one of those things that's nearly impossible to take up and down stairs in any kind of safe manner. So if you can avoid it, other than a few maybe basic steps in and out of a house, you want to make sure that you're not trying to float a patient with the additional weight of a gurney. As with any tool that you guys have, you need to follow the manufacturer's direction, including the maintenance, the inspections, the weight limitations, when to repair something, and how you're going to keep it up to service. And so for us, that's cleaning the device or the stretcher before you start your shift. You want to make sure you take a good look at it, make sure there's no loose bolts, and that everything functions the way it's properly designed to function. And if there is something out of spec or damaged, you should probably take that out of service and have that repaired before you put a patient on it. Now, in regards to any of the other things, stair chairs or mega movers, right, all of these things should be inspected, and we should all know what the weight limitations are. You never want to put a bariatric patient on perhaps a standardized patient's mega mover, right? We're going to exceed the fabric capabilities or the stitching for the handles, and we certainly don't want to create a hazardous situation if we overload a typical gurney. Now, most gurneys that are the electric over hydraulic are going to be in the neighborhood of 700 pounds, but it requires assistance from the people who are actually utilizing the device to help assist the gurney into an up position when you're anywhere near 500 pounds on a patient. And just because it can take 700 pounds doesn't mean it's the safest way to move that patient. That is its outright maximum capability before a failure is logically imminent. Okay, so this is really, think about what you're doing before you do it. And with anything in regards to moving a patient, we're talking about something like Tetris. You should be looking at the small idiosyncrasies about how you're going to move your patient out of a room, where the providers are going to be positioned, and how they're going to make their way through. Most door frames are not very wide. You might have a 30 to a 32 inch wide door. You stack a fairly decent sized patient and 2 providers, it's going to get really tight. So one provider will go through, it'll obviously then be a little bit of a movement for the patient, and then the next provider. But these are things that we should think about before we get to that position where people are bunched up or bounced into a wall or against other objects. We absolutely want to protect the patient's head, and so the head should always be the last thing moving through, right? We should typically move a patient feet first so that we can protect them and make sure that if anything is going to be manipulated, that we keep their safety of paramount importance. You only want to carry your patient or move them for the smallest amount of time or distance possible. The more likely option is to get them on something that's safe and secure, such as your cot or your stair chair, or into the back of the rig. Once they're on the cot or the stair chair, we really want to keep movement to a minimum, and we want them secured and safe. So this is still talking about planning the move, and this says additional steps, right? And again, we will place patients onto a backboard for extrication purposes, but the practice of using that as a continued spinal immobilization, or kind of, those are done days. And then we want to make sure that every opportunity that we get to reposition so that the provider is the safe one, we are going to utilize that. So if we have to go down a set of stairs or up a set of stairs or down a very narrow, kind of tight wandering hallway, make sure that you guys plan it out, figure out who's going to move when and where and how to do that, and then utilize teamwork and communication to its maximum effectiveness. Okay, so this again is another no-brainer, right? If something has wheels, we want to use them. That's why we invented the wheel. it makes moving loads much more easy than, say, dragging or carrying. So if we can distribute that weight and have weight help us to continue to make movement, that's perfect. If you have to carry a stretcher, you should always have as many hands on deck as you can, because that is an awkward, heavy piece of equipment, and we want to keep that to a minimum. All right, so if you guys are looking at this picture, you can see what they're calling a diamond carry, and this is what we would call a 4-point in our system. That's what we most typically call a 4-point, is what I should say. And you have a rescuer at the head, at the feet, and then one on each side. Quite often, with the resources that are available in the city area, you could have upwards of 6 or 7 people that want to be in there. Make sure that we don't overwhelm the patient or overload to one side. Use the maximum amount of people that are useful, but no more. Now we're looking at what says a one-handed carrying technique. And this is quite literally just you using a single hand and facing the direction of travel so that you can keep your spine in alignment and keep a normal momentum and movement technique. Typically, if you're using both hands while you're carrying a gurney with a patient on it, you are twisted and you are side shuffling, which is not a normal pattern of movement and could lead to somebody tripping, falling, and then ultimately could end up further injuring your patient. When you're carrying your patient on the stairs, make sure that you're using a stair chair whenever you really can, because it's probably your best friend to do that. And if you have to do it with a backboard, make sure that somebody is absolutely secured to the device. The last thing that you want is to tip the board up at a 45-degree angle or what have you, as far as where the stairs are in orientation to degrees, and have that patient slide, get caught up into the webbing or the straps, or ultimately fall off the board. Right? Those are all disasters waiting to happen, and we should practice that and make sure that we're discussing those things before we actually get to that point. So teamwork is dream work. One leader, the rest should be followers, and we want to make sure that the leader is looking and observing everything that needs to happen. They should generally be at the head of the patient, and they're going to dictate the direction and the speed of travel. They're also in charge of protecting that patient's head. So if you give a command, everybody else should be on point and ready and listening. And so the way that this is talked about is it's given in 2 parts. A preparatory command, which would be like ready to move right, and then a command of execution, which is move right. Very often we don't do that, and you'll see when you're out in the field, when people are not communicating, people get flustered or bumped into other things because they're not moving in sync with the rest of